Let's start this up all over again. All right. So, this is going to be a quick, well, maybe not quick, but a video about this idea I had. Um, so, in a lot of simulation games or strategy games or just pretty much any games, there's a lot of procedural map generation in games nowadays. And one of the things I was thinking about is so you have a map and you could think of the map in the game as a grid, right? And let's say I want to apply a effect to a single tile, something like trees growing in a or a forest is sprouted or something like that, right? So if you do that, it's going to affect everything around it, or that's what you would expect, right? If a volcano appears somewhere and there's a forest in the next tile, you don't think the forest is just kind of going to be like, oh, word, volcano, like those temperatures don't affect me at all. There would be some sort of resulting effect of the volcano being placed next to that other tile with the forest or whatever. Anyway, so the idea is that 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 effect would ripple out and affect other tiles around it, right? So I just wanted to kind of test this idea of a ripple effect through a grid. And basically what you would do is you'd have a 10 by 10 grid squares. When you click on a square, it applies effect to that square, right? And then every other adjacent square has a 50% chance of having that effect ripple to it. And then 2 tiles away has a 25% chance, and so on and so forth. 50% or 0.5 to the n based on where n is the distance from the original click target, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm in CodePen right now. CodePen is a little playground for front-end developers. People have all sorts of their little animations and stuff that they show off. A lot of CSS stuff. I use it for JavaScript. I'll do stuff like I was recently working on linked scroll containers. Let's see. Linked scroll containers. So if you scroll in one, it'll scroll the other one. So that's just like a JavaScript test, and this is going to be kind of like that, kind of like a JavaScript test. In a nutshell, it allows you to write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and then this portion down here is a web page with all that stuff injected into it. Again, it's a front-end developer's playground. So what I've done is I've started making the grid here. I have a container. Container has 200 pixels height and width, so it's a box. It's blue and it has a black border. And then I've made a row, a child of this container, a row, which is this div. It has a height of 20 and a background of white. Now you don't see white, well, other than all of this, inside the container anyway, because it also has 10 children, each with the class of square. And that has, I would just read this as 20. They have a width of 20 pixels and their background color is green. There's 10 of them. And they have a height of 100%. So that means they height 100% is based off the height of the parent. So the parent is row, square's parent is row, row is a height 20, so they have a height of 20. They're floated left, so they butt up against each other all nice. And they have a border of a 1 pixel border of black around the entire thing, just so you can kind of see where each one is. Yeah. So we have one row, and we have 10 squares, and of course I could do something like, not like that, that's not what I wanted to do. Do this, and then I would have my grid. That's a very static way of doing this, but let's throw a little JavaScript into the mix here. Let's close our console. So JavaScript, how can I do this programmatically? So obviously, I have a container, right? So what I'm doing when I'm copying and pasting this is I'm just taking this element and all of its children and copying it and then appending it to the container here, right? So I can actually do that programmatically. First, well, actually not first. First, we will, so what we're copying is this div, right? And then this div of class row, and it's 10 children of class square. So first, we're going to create the div class row. So we're going to do var, ignore var for now, var row. Well, if you've been writing JavaScript, then you know what var is, so I'm just going to glaze over that or whatever. So var row is going to be equal to document dot create element. I don't even know if that's the right API. Anyways, var rows equal to document dot create element, and then so we have a row. Cool. If we were to do this manually, it should show up as a white row underneath. Okay, cool. So that's what it looks like if we did it manually. So we have our row, but we don't. Really all we have is a div, right? So what makes it a row? Well, it has a class of row over here. So what we need to do is row.classList.add row. So what we're saying is class list is an API for adding and removing and checking what classes an element has. It's a newer thing. I don't think it's supported before like IE9 and that sort of thing, but it's dope and you should use it. It's pretty easy to read. Row dot, okay, the class list of row, I want to add class row. Cool. So now we have a div with class row. Okay, now we want to add it to the container. So we're going to do var container. So this time we're not creating a container, but we're trying to get this existing one, this existing container, or this existing container, whether you want to view it in its rendered HTML or the markup. So we're going to use query selector. So where query selector is just a way of querying the document, the DOM, for a specific element. So the way you do that is by using IDs, using the type of element. In this case, since container is a unique class, there's only one container. I'm just going to query for dot container, which is this dot notation is referring to class. So I'm querying the document for an element that has class container. Query selector returns the first instance of that. If we had two containers, it would return the first one that showed up in its perusal of the DOM. You can also do query selector all if we wanted more than one, but we don't. Maybe we'll use that later. So anyways, we should have our container. Let's do a console.log, and let's open up our console. Command, well, I don't know if you use a Mac. It's Control-Shift-I on Windows, and you can see I have all these nice little syntax errors because I don't even know. Chrome sucks on my computer. But the important thing is we do have one console.log, and it's our container. And you can see if I hover over it, because Chrome's awesome, well, all modern browsers are awesome, it actually highlights the element on the screen. So we got our container. Nice. Okay. Don't need the console. Now what we want to do is we want to add that row. So we're going to do container.appendChild row. You can see it showed up. Nice. So that so what we did was we created a row. We added a class of row. Rather, we created a div, and then we made it a row by adding a class of row. Then we found our container on the DOM. We appended the child. Pretty simple stuff. Okay, not that cool. We also don't have our square elements. So what we're going to do actually before that now, so we have our, let's add some comments here. So this is get container, append the row to our container. Cool. Okay, and this is create a div, make it a row by adding class row. So what do we need to do here? To do add squares to our row. So similar to last time, what we're going to do is we're going to create a square, right? Or rather, we're going to create a div, and then we're going to make it a square by doing square.classlist.add square. Cool. And then we need to put it in our row, right? Make it a child of our row. So row.append child, similar to what we did with the container and the row.append child square. So now we see we got our row and it's got one square. Okay, well we only have one square. We need to do this, we need 10, right? So we're going to use a for loop. So I assume you're familiar with for loops. You can assign any number of variables here. You define the stop condition, and then you define an iterator. So we're saying start at 0, count to less than 10, so 0 to 9, and then do stuff inside here. So we can actually just totally copy and paste. This is our step that we want repeated 10 times. This creating a square, creating a div, giving it the class square, and then appending it to the row. And look, we got our 10 here. And then what we can actually do is add squares to row. Okay. Let's make this a function. So let's make this var. Let's call it add squares to row. Very explicit. I don't try to be very clever with my naming of functions. So now what we've noticed is the squares are gone. That's because this is not being executed anymore because we haven't called the function, right? If I call the function, then we'll see our row has the squares in it again. Okay. This is not that good of a function, I would say, because it kind of just statically takes whatever row we've defined above. It's implicitly using a variable that is defined outside of the function. It's usually better to have a function that takes parameters and uses those instead of relying on something to be defined in the background, because then if I comment this out, we're going to get a fat error in the console. Uncaught reference error, row is not defined. So that's a problem, right? So let's define row as a parameter for this function. So now this function is add squares to row, and it takes a row to add those 10 squares to, right? That's what's going on in here. So we can uncomment this and then pass row, and the same thing will happen. So what we're saying is, let's move this. Let's not move it. So it's kind of a high level thing. It's kind of a, I'm trying to think how to explain it. It's a refactor. I don't know. I guess if we're just looking for getting shit done, it's not that useful. But it is useful if you think about it in terms of, so we only have our one row here, But what if I want to use this function on other rows? If you were basing it on implicitly defined row, it would be hard to do that. But what we can do is, so similar to how we pulled out the function of creating a square and adding it to a row and iterated over it 10 times, we can pull this code and make it a, well, actually, we can pull this code and do the same thing, because we need 10 rows, right? We're going to have an error here, which is good. I'm going to move this function up. So we have an error. Why? Because, so we define this function, add squares to row, right? And it requires row to be passed into it, right? And we're passing row into it down here. We're calling the function and passing row. But where's row being defined? Nowhere, pretty much. It's being defined inside of this for loop, which I believe means it's not being defined at all. So what we should actually be doing, sorry, it's not that it's not being defined at all. One thing you learn about JavaScript, one of the big things is how things are scoped, right? So that's the big thing with var. So this var row, right? I'm declaring a variable row, but it's inside of the context of this for loop. And this context is only inside of this for loop, only inside this block, right? Only between these two curly braces. So when I call row down here, I get an error. I assume I get an error. Yes, I get, let's see. I can't tell because it doesn't move the, actually I guess I'm not getting error. Interesting. Oh, yeah. No, it totally is accessible out of that context. There's a more insidious error going on here. Anyways, I'm just going to move this and then explain what it does afterwards. And I'm going to move this and explain what it does afterwards. And I'm going to move this up here and explain what it does afterwards. Oh, that worked. Okay, cool. How to explain what I'm doing? So what we're doing is, and actually because of that we can move this. So I'll just explain basically line by line what's happening in the code here. So we have our container like last time, we're defining our container. Then what we're doing is we're doing the same thing, for loop 10 times, and each time we're creating a row, we're creating a div, giving it the class of row, so we're creating a row. You could think of that in these steps. And actually pulling out functions like this will make code easier to read. So we could actually, I say we create a row, these two steps are creating a row. You could actually do create row, right? Damn you, CodePen. And we could actually make this a function, var create row. Now the reason why you have to return row is Otherwise, you're not really doing anything here, right? I could kind of be. All right, let's not do that. Maybe that's confusing. Whatever. Let's say, so we're going to create a row, and then we're going to call add squares to row, passing our row to that function. We went over that before, that iterates 10 times, does the same thing, creates a square, and appends the square to the row 10 times. And then we append the row to the container. It's pretty straightforward. So that's how we made our grid via JavaScript. Now, of course, we alternatively could have just copied and pasted this 10 times. That's a more static way of doing this. But obviously, if you're actually working with a game or something and it's all going to be procedurally generated, you're not going to just be working with an HTML file that you're going to load. Now, you might save them as an HTML file, and that's a totally valid way of displaying them later. But your initial procedural generation of those is going to probably be through JavaScript or whatever you're coding in, right? You could presumably write HTML using Python or any other language. It's just text, right? So what's next? We have our grid, and that's not that amazing. I'm actually going to refactor this code. I'm going to do that whole create row thing, just so this is easier to read and modify. I'll save this code somewhere so it can be easy to read and you can go back and kind of just play around with this and understand what's going on. It's a lot easier to read in my mind, so basically what we're saying is create a row. Well, yeah, I guess we are. Just create and append a row to the container 10 times. Alright, so create a row, add squares to the row, and append it to the container. I think that's a lot easier to read, assuming you're just not. And then you can go back and read these afterwards to understand it. That's kind of a pattern in programming that you get used to, is you want to have something like this that you can high level interpret and be like, oh, okay, so this is how this function, it creates a row, adds the squares, and appends it to the container. And maybe you don't necessarily need to understand the inner workings of how add squares to row works, but you can kind of read it in terms of how you would read text, instead of reading it in terms of some, create element, add class, iterate it through a for loop, etc., etc. You can read it from a more high level perspective. Okay, what time are we at here?